Hello, my name is Jeff Durant, and this is my final project, which aims to investigate if there is a statistically significant difference in performance between drafted and undrafted players. The NFL draft is a very important time for teams hoping to bolster their roster without spending a lot of money in free agency. The results from a team that drafts strategically and makes the correct picks could be the difference between making the playoffs and not. How do teams know which players they should draft? How do teams know which players they can wait on and which players they need to draft immediately? The NFL Combine is a pre-draft test where athletes compete to display their physical abilities for teams that are watching. There are many tests that exist in the NFL Combine, such as the 40-yard dash, which is running a timed 40-yard sprint, the vertical jump, which measures how high a person can jump from a stationary position, and the bench press repetition, which measures how many repetitions an athlete can perform before failure. However, does an athlete's performance in these physical tests actually matter? The purpose of this research case is to investigate if a performance difference exists between drafted and undrafted players based on three tests: the 40-yard dash, the vertical jump, and the bench press. There are several research articles published to investigate the difference between drafted and undrafted players at the NFL Combine. McGee and Burkett in 2003 investigated a relationship between NFL Combine performance and draft success. The results of this study indicate that the 40-yard dash results were highly correlated with results of other tests, and the running backs and wide receivers demonstrated a positive correlation between Combine performance and draft success. Sear et al. In 2008 investigated if a performance difference exists between three different categories of players for drafted and undrafted. They concluded that drafted players performed better than undrafted players in several categories at a statistically significant level. The 40-yard dash time was statistically different between drafted and undrafted players, while the 225-pound bench repetition press was not statistically different. Kuzmits and Adams in 2008 investigated if the NFL Combine results can be used to predict the performance in the NFL. This article raises the question about the NFL Combine relevance to the correlation of NFL performance, regardless if the person is drafted or not. The results from Kuzmits and Adams indicate that there is not a statistically significant relationship between Combine performance and NFL success. Based on theoretical work, 5 hypotheses were developed using 3 variables: 40-yard dash, the vertical, and the bench press repetition. For 40-yard dash, the first hypothesis investigates the difference between means between drafted and undrafted players. The null states that there is no difference in means between the drafted and undrafted players. The second hypothesis investigates a relationship between the 40-yard dash time and draft status. The null hypothesis for this indicates that there is no relationship between the 40-yard dash time and draft status. The third hypothesis for vertical investigates a difference between means for drafted and undrafted players. The null states that there is no difference in means between drafted and undrafted players. The fourth hypothesis investigates a relationship between vertical and draft status. The null states that a relationship does not exist between vertical and draft status. The fifth hypothesis for bench press investigates the difference in means between drafted and undrafted players. The null hypothesis states that there is no difference in means between drafted and undrafted players. To test the hypotheses, raw data was compiled from the NFL Combine athletes of 2018. For these athletes, only players that classify themselves as quarterbacks, wide receivers, or running backs were included, which yielded a sample size of 94. Since the scope of this project was to investigate the difference between two groups, drafted and undrafted, the population was stratified into 2 stratas, drafted and undrafted. Using these 2 groups treated as populations for the scope of this project, systematic sampling was performed to pick 12 samples of each strata. Since the population standard deviation was known, the z-test was ran to test hypotheses A, C, and E. Given that the sample size was less than 30, it must be assumed that the sample follows a normal distribution. Microsoft Excel was used to run multiple regression for both vertical and 40-yard dash to see if these were dependent on 3 independent variables: height, weight, and draft status. Since the draft status is qualitative, the numerical value of 1 was assigned to those that were drafted. This tested hypothesis B and D. Everything will be tested at a 0.05 significance level. The above table is the results from the z-test statistic to determine if a difference in mean exists between drafted and undrafted players. Since each p-value is above the significance level of 0.05 for all three, the 40-yard dash, the vertical, and the bench press, it is determined that there is insufficient evidence to conclude a difference between mean exists for the drafted and undrafted players. The null hypothesis is not rejected for any of these three. The results for the above multiple regression tests to test the vertical dependence on height, weight, and draft status indicate that the regression model p-value of 0.1925 is not statistically significant. Furthermore, since the p-value for drafted is above 0.05, the null is not rejected. This means that there is insufficient evidence to conclude that a relationship exists between drafted and vertical. The results for the above multiple regression test for the 40-yard dash of the dependence on height, weight, and draft status indicate the regression model p-value of 0.025 is statistically significant. However, the p-value for drafted is above 0.05, so this null is not rejected. This means that there is insufficient evidence to conclude that a relationship exists between draft status and vertical. But there is sufficient evidence to conclude a relationship exists between height and 40-yard time. Since all five hypotheses failed to reject the null, it can be concluded that for this case study, with this sample size at this significance level, there is not a difference in performance between drafted and undrafted players for the three variables measured: the 40-yard dash, the vertical, and the bench press repetition. However, just because this case study failed to prove a statistically significant difference in performance between drafted and undrafted players, it does not mean that a difference does not exist. To further investigate, it would be recommended to increase the sample size to include other positions, expand the year beyond just 2018, or stratify the sample based on position and not draft status. There seems to be indication that there are other factors that go into deciding whether a person is drafted or not, and the NFL Combine performance is not a major influence. It is important to note that since the NFL Combine tests physical attributes and does not quantify mental attributes or college stats, it is possible that mental attributes and college performance is a bigger deciding factor on whether a person is drafted or not. In conclusion, this case study failed to reject the null for any of the five hypotheses, leading one to believe there is insufficient evidence to conclude a difference in mean exists between drafted and undrafted players for 40-yard dash, vertical, and bench press repetition. Also, there is insufficient evidence that a relationship exists between 40-yard dash and draft status, and also vertical time at draft status for this study. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I wish everybody luck in their future endeavors.